Good evening and welcome to the Cedar Falls City Council work session. Tonight we're going to be talking about parking as it pertains to the newly proposed downtown zoning ordinance. And I believe we have a presentation from Ms. Karen Howard, and then we'll get into talking about it. Welcome.
Okay, thank you, Council. We have Mary Madden and Jeff Farrell on the Zoom, and they are actually going to be making the presentation tonight. So I would just hand it over to them, and then we'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Well, I thought I was sharing. Okay, can everyone see and hear that?
I can hear you, and we can see.
Okay. Thank you very much for having us this evening. I am going to just provide a high-level overview of what is included in the proposed downtown ordinance related to parking for private development. And I will just jump right into the presentation. I want to start out just by reminding everybody that this, the downtown draft code as proposed came out of the visioning work for the downtown plan. And so related to parking in particular, we were looking at building on the study that you all had done as far as the public parking on the streets and parking lots. And then as far as the downtown zoning ordinance, we were looking at parking for private development. A few key points that you'll see on the screen that we included in the plan and how we built the recommendations going forward. We heard a lot about there being parking scattered around downtown, private parking being underutilized at different times of day, lots sitting empty. And we also heard about people's concerns that the parking requirements were such that it made it very difficult to do redevelopment or infill in the downtown area, particularly related to residential development. So the standards that you have in front of you had several goals. One is to reduce the amount and locations of single-purpose parking, to provide more flexibility for redevelopment, particularly of small sites that you have quite a few of around downtown, and to make it easier to reuse existing buildings, to make sure that publicly accessible, available parking would be clearly visible and well labeled. And then a really big concept is the idea to focus on creating shared publicly available parking. Again, so that you would create a larger pool of parking beyond just that's on the streets or public lots, that could be used throughout the day or week as appropriate, depending on when the private use was needed. So those are big ideas that this proposal includes. So just as a little background, for those of you who may not be familiar with the current parking requirements, currently in the CBD overlay, which is very similar to what is designated the storefront and the general urban frontages, the red and orange on the proposed regulating plan. There is no new parking required for commercial, professional office, or service business uses. For mixed-use buildings, there are requirements for additional parking for the residential uses in upper stories. That is reviewed by both the Planning Commission and the City Council. As noted here, the ordinance itself is a little bit unclear, but the recent practice has been to require one space for every additional bedroom that is constructed in the CBD area. Citywide, as you may know, residential dwellings are required to provide 2 spaces per unit. Renter-occupied had 2 per unit plus a space for each additional bedroom above 2 bedrooms. It goes up accordingly. So this is the system that you all have currently. The CBD overlay is very unique, but then the rest of the city is uniform across, regardless of the context and location. The proposed standards that you have in the downtown district would really build on what you have and try to provide some clarity and to make some redevelopment easier, as we identified in those intent bullets at the beginning. So continuing with the current standards, there would be no parking requirements for those existing buildings on the parkade. So everything on Main Street from First Street to Sixth Street would be exempt for a minimum parking requirements regardless of the use. In addition, building on the current standard for no parking for commercial uses, ground floor commercial space developed in the downtown area would continue to have no parking requirement. If you reuse an existing building around downtown, you would also not be required to provide additional parking as long as the building was not expanded or that you weren't converting the building from a commercial use to a residential use. A really big concept, as I mentioned, is the idea of reserved parking versus shared parking. Reserved parking would be those spaces that a user, a building would be required to have for the tenants of the building. Shared parking could be kept for users, but also would be available for at least half the day to other people. So the reserved parking would continue to have no requirements for commercial and civic uses. For residential uses, the proposed standard for reserved parking would be 1/2 space per bedroom. And then as you move into the neighborhoods, as you move into single units, 2 units, row houses, et cetera, for owner-occupied units, there would be 1 space per unit. For rental units, 1 per unit plus 1 bedroom for those units that have 3 or more bedrooms. The idea of shared parking are those spaces that for at least half a day would be more broadly available. So again, this General Urban 2, and storefront frontages, you would need to have parking within a 600-foot walking distance, which in Cedar Falls is approximately 2 blocks. That would be clearly marked of when those spaces were available for the public. For buildings that had commercial space on the upstairs, for smaller buildings, there would not be an additional requirement. For larger buildings, you would add to the shared parking pool for the larger district. Again, then residential units in mixed-use buildings or multi-unit buildings would provide an additional 1/4 space per bedroom that would be available for shared parking, visitor parking, etc. When you move into the neighborhood frontages outside of the area that's traditionally thought of as downtown, the reserved parking for multi-unit buildings would be at a 0.75 per bedroom, again, differentiating between single units, duplexes, row houses, or cottage courts. 1 space per unit for owner-occupied, 1 space per unit plus additional for the larger units. And as the code does allow those businesses in those areas to continue and to expand, they would continue to have 1 space per 300 square feet if they were going to increase their business size. For those neighborhood areas, we would also have the shared parking requirement at 0.25 per bedroom. So that is a high-level overview of what is in the proposed standards. If I can somehow turn off my shared, I don't know. I know this evening is for you all to, the work session for you all to discuss the proposed standards as well as to ask us questions. And so we want to, I will release the microphone and the screen, and we will be on standby to answer any questions you might have as you discuss what's proposed before you.
All right, thank you very much. Well, without further ado, we'll go right into it. Susan, go for it.
Could you explain for me or define exactly what you mean by shared parking?
Okay, the idea is that there Currently, the parking as required for private development is on-site and maintained solely for the exclusive use of the development. Currently, it's only required for residential parking to provide that, and we heard while we were working on the downtown vision plan that there were large lots or medium-sized lots that were constructed in relation to some of the new residential developments in downtown that were in excess of what they apparently needed, and they sit empty for large portions of the day. And so the idea of the shared parking is to make sure some of that parking could be available for people other than residents or tenants. It's basically an accessible pool of parking within a large walkable district so that you don't have lots sitting empty in some of the most valuable real estate in Cedar Falls and downtown.
So are you saying it's property privately owned by someone else that you're trying to say anyone can park in? For instance, just to pick a business, say McDonald's. Are you saying that their parking lot could be used by anyone for any purpose? Is that, I'm trying to understand the concept.
This would not apply to any existing use, and if you go back to, I can jump back to the screen if possible. If someone is doing a single unit commercial building, their standards would kick in a little bit differently. Let me see if I can get back there.
See, what I'm really trying to find out is if it's privately owned, who pays the property tax on it or the liability insurance on it when it's used for public use?
Right, I'm trying to get the screen up so you can see the numbers. 1 second. I've lost my share. Is that visible?
Yes, it is.
So if you're doing a one-story building such as a McDonald's, et cetera, you would not have the shared parking. But as you increase the size of the building where you would be more likely to having parking sitting there, then the shared parking requirements would come in. In some respects, the idea is to create an incentive for people to make the parking available for part of the day. In some communities, it's done because the leadership and the business leadership of the community thinks it's important for the downtown district to have parking available. This would be a policy decision for the city. I mean, the recommendation is that it be available for half the time. In some communities, it is available, but it doesn't have to be provided for free, so there could be a fee-based system. But it's mostly trying to just increase the availability of parking in the downtown core at different hours of the day.
So maybe an example would be a building that had office use in it because they had to provide 1.25 spaces as shared parking when the office is not open in the evening, but yet we have the peak hour parking. When the restaurants are open, their parking that was on their site could then, they would sign it and know where those specific spots were that were publicly accessible, and those would become available then to the public to use during those times.
And there again, who pays the property tax on that land or that, and then same thing, the liability insurance, is that something the city picks up then?
No, it would be the private property owner. It's part of their development, part of their requirements.
So following up on that, you got a number of existing private lots that are being used, whether the building owner openly permits it or not. How do we handle that where the public is using that, to Susan's point, carry it on to maintaining, cleaning up cigarette butts? I've heard some interesting stories calling out to some business owners that have shared lots, as you call it, private lots. I thought it was kind of interesting, you say they're fragmented, uncoordinated, inefficient. These were prescribed by the building code back in the day to have those, or they chose to have those. And now you're telling these people that they have to share them. And the city's not taking any liability. They have to replace them in 20 years because we say concrete lasts 20 years. How does that get financed?
These requirements would not apply to any existing lots. This is for new development moving forward. So it doesn't address if people are already using private lots. You know, that would continue as it is unless, I mean, it wouldn't be, no change would occur under the proposed zoning, but this would be for new development moving forward.
So you're saying in a residential new development, they have to allow 1/4 of their parking to be used by the public, even though that building may be fully rented in a real popular spot where guests are coming, they still have to give up 1/4 of their spots for public use?
Well, as we indicated, it only would be for half the day, 12 hours of any given day. So typically what that would mean, if it's residential, that those might be available during the day and not during the evening. This is a way to try to better manage parking and the supply of parking in the downtown so that lots don't sit empty for 8, 12, 16 hours a day, and then have the people complaining that there's not enough parking in downtown Cedar Falls. So this is trying to think of parking as more a resource available throughout the downtown. You might call it a semi-public infrastructure of making sure that available parking is there at different hours, different users need it at different times of day. I think Cedar Falls has not been doing this, but it is very common in many cities for the last 10, 12, 15 years, because parking takes up a considerable land area, and trying to make better use of the land in downtown Cedar Falls, where you have the infrastructure, where you have the water and sewer, where you have a lot of different kinds of businesses. So just trying to think a little bit more holistically about development moving forward.
Well, Mary, can you give us examples of cities the size of Cedar Falls that you're referring to? I mean, you got cities like Des Moines, Iowa City, where you got a medical facility, you got 70,000 capacity football stadium, and there's a whole difference there in environment than we have here. So in our type of community, we have space, we like space, people want space. I hear complaints continuously about not enough parking downtown. And it's not just the parking right in front of the store you want to go to. Overwhelmingly, everyone I spoke to downtown that is a business owner is against this. And I think we're in need of more public feedback and not just roll this forward. But I'm very interested in what communities our size of 40,000 people are implementing a shared program where you're telling them that they have to share their parking. For example, with COVID, the stay-at-home worker, and if you're relying on 1/4 of the parking to be available to the shoppers and customers of the boutique shops and so on, but now it's filled because of the stay-at-home worker, or I come home from work early, or I have a different shift than 10 to 5 when a boutique store is open, my spots are filled, and I'd be rather ticked off if a building that I buy a condo in doesn't have enough parking for me.
The most common example I've seen is where they actually differentiate and say this section of the parking is reserved for our residential tenants. So if you bought a unit and you know you have one space that comes with your unit, I've seen it regulated by having different locations, having key card access. So it doesn't have to be, everybody, just a chaos that all parking is available for everybody. It's an idea of how to get more parking provided that is accessible to more people. So I'm interested and surprised a little bit that the existing business owners are opposed to having more parking provided in downtown that their customers might use. But, you know, we talked to folks now, it's been almost 2 years ago. So I'm, you know, this is based on what we learned during the downtown vision planning effort, as well as what we learned from the downtown study of the existing public parking.
But Mary, you're proposing only 3/4 of a parking spot per bedroom. And if I buy a condo, and they're real popular condos, and they get filled, which I'm assuming they will downtown, you're gonna have a shortage of parking immediately, not counting any guest spots, which our current code requires guest parking for visitors. I think this is going to be just, contribute to a disaster if you overbuild and underpark. I just do.
Well, I would like to clarify, this does not prohibit someone from building 1 parking space per bedroom. They could build 3 parking spaces per unit. It does not prohibit a developer from building absolutely as much parking as they believe they need. But what it does provide them is the flexibility if they believe they are going to be selling or renting units to single adults who don't have a car, or a couple that has 1 car and not 2 cars. It provides them flexibility to match more what they believe their demand is. If they miscalculate that and don't have enough parking, I would presume that would mean they would be unable to either sell or lease their units. But this gets out of the city government trying to tell each individual developer exactly how much parking they need. It's the idea for the developer to determine what they believe their market will require.
Well, to follow up on that comment, the shortage of residential parking in the new development will go into the parking for the customers, or it'll go onto the residential streets and sit there continuously. If you have a couple with 2 cars in a 2-bedroom unit, and they have 1.5 spots, there's going to be a push to go out into the residential areas or nooks and crannies where they'll sit and take away from the current business owners who need waitstaff parking and shop personnel. Our downtown is only 2 blocks wide and 6 blocks long, and there's going to be a spillover into the perimeter with this philosophy here. This isn't a big city that we're dealing with. Cedar Falls is unique. It's a destination city. And in the conversations that I had, one shop owner said between 30 and 40% of her customers come from out of town. They're not in town. They're driving in to use our streets and shop. And if those streets are filled with the residents, it's going to be a problem. It's going to hurt that business owner in their customer base. And we've become a destination. So I think this needs more thought, more involvement and feedback by many of the merchants downtown before we go forward with this.
I have 2 questions. One would be, could you elaborate on how guidelines like this have come to fruition, like how these parking numbers come about and just why people use them? I'm assuming that these numbers aren't arbitrarily just picked out of air for Cedar Falls randomly, and that there's probably a lot of study that goes into this. So I'd be interested to know the history of that. And then 2, I'd also be interested in learning, since we're specifically focusing on new development, I mean, Daryl said we're only 2 blocks away. We don't have that much room for new development. So the fact of the matter is that we don't really have that much ability to build these big buildings down there, so with residential spaces. So I guess I'd like to see, like, where do we have a map that shows where this development could happen and why we would be worried about possibly under parking? Because it's, like I said, it's a lot of new stuff. So those are my 2 questions.
Karen, I don't know if you want me to answer that or Jeff, or if you would like to. I mean, there's a lot of questions there, Councilman, but I don't want to bore you with the whole history of parking numbers, but they basically were non-existent before the 50s, 60s or so, tying them to zoning. And then if you look at the history of Cedar Falls, you will know that the 2-block wide downtown used to be about 5 blocks wide, and now there are extensive surface parking lots when you get a block and a half off of the parkade. When we worked on the downtown visioning plan, one of the main comments that we heard was there was frustration that downtown had a considerable percentage of surface parking lots that could be developed with buildings, potentially with parking structure, mixed-use buildings, line structures. So a lot of that detail and elaboration was incorporated into the downtown vision plan. These numbers that we have recommended are an increment less than you currently have. They are not as aggressive as Councilman Cruz has indicated in bigger cities. There are many that have completely done away with all of their minimum parking requirements, where they've said if people are in our downtown mixed-use development, let's separate the parking from the residential units. If someone buys a condo, they could buy one with or without a space. We didn't make recommendations like that. We didn't feel like Cedar Falls was anywhere close to moving to that type of environment. But it does seem that there are opportunities to develop and redevelop around the core of downtown, east and west of Main Street, where you could get more people living, working, going out to eat, shopping in downtown, with a little more intense use of the land area that you have, and not have the expectation. We do understand, we heard a lot of positive about the destination of the shops on the parkade, but we also heard folks wish that there were more things there for people who do live in Cedar Falls, and we know a lot of the restaurants are visited and the bars by people who live in Cedar Falls. So this proposal is trying to encourage the redevelopment envisioned in the downtown vision plan, and also try to incentivize more parking to be developed that, at least for part of the day, could be available for more people. I understand what Councilman Cruz is saying, that people may park, you know, if someone has 2 cars and they rent a unit that doesn't have 2 spaces, I'm not sure whose responsibility that is. My understanding is the downtown parking has time limits, so they shouldn't be able to leave their car there for extended periods of time.
Karen, can you answer that, since I do think it's an interesting question. How did you come up with like a half a parking spot or the 1 per unit? How did those numbers come up, like Simon asked?
What we tried to do is, well, one of the things that came up in the parking study was that the parking consultant said, you seem to be over parking your residential and perhaps under parking your office spaces, because we had 0 parking required for the office. And the other thing they mentioned in the parking study was there's a lot of surface parking lots that are locked up and can't be used in the evening times when it's peak parking. Think of all the bank parking lots, for example. And I know after that parking study was done, the mayor at the time negotiated with Viking Pump, for example, to make their lot available. And to your point, they, you know, tried to reassure them about the liability and the cleanup of the lots. So what we're trying to do moving forward is say if there's a new project, they can build that right into their pro forma right up front, decide where those shared parking spaces will be for that development so that they're easily accessible, they're marked, they can build it right into their cost structure. They can even charge for it. So there's nothing, if there's an ongoing cost to maintaining and liability insurance and that sort of thing, they can build it into their model right from the beginning. We're trying to backtrack a lot on our surface parking lots that we have down there right now, because the businesses are saying that at certain peak times, it would really be nice if we had more parking available during events and during peak times. And there's an awful lot of surface parking lots that aren't city lots that are sitting there not being utilized during those peak times. And so now we're having to backtrack to try to negotiate these things after the fact. And so we're trying to get ahead of that and think about how to do that in the future in a better way and more thoughtful way.
But if I could, but none of this form-based zoning or this applies to anything that currently exists. You're just talking about new. So when you use the bank parking lot as an example, that'd still be sitting empty.
Well, right, and we don't want to have that happen going forward. So if we set the parking requirements as high as they were in the 1970s, for example, that's the reason there's such a large surface parking lot there for the bank that's underutilized, perhaps, because the parking requirements at the time were probably 4 spaces per 1,000 square feet or something like that. So we see that parking that's there now because of the requirements at that particular time. We're trying to do a little bit better and say, okay, we're going to try to do a shared parking model as we move forward. So what we can do with the shared parking or the parking lots right now, like the bank parking lot, is continue to negotiate with them and try to see if we can use that parking during, we'll have to go to them specifically and ask if it can be shared during events and that sort of thing.
That was my next question, have we looked at an agreement or something along those lines? I mean, similar to Viking Pump or the banks or where these existing lots are, can they get involved in this program as well, or is it a totally separate agreement, or how does that work?
So just want to make sure that we're distinguishing the regulations that are in the zoning ordinance relate to private off-street parking on a private lot. So nothing in here prevents us from negotiating and working through issues for existing properties and trying to make some of those spaces that are underutilized more available during the times when we need it most.
So the bank, like you mentioned, right now, if they wanted to, they could rent those parking spots or not?
Yes,
Sure.
they could, and in fact, I believe that Community Main Street took a lot of effort to contact private property owners to talk about maybe could some employees use some of these parking spots. So they've been a partner in trying to help with some of that private parking be a little bit more shared.
So they were willing to pay for those, but like last meeting, our public lots, they wanted free? Is that how it's supposed to be?
I couldn't speak to whether there was an agreement about payment or not. I guess I was more meaning that there were agreements about the ability to share parking.
I think it's a little confusing, and I think it's going to take us a while to figure it out. I think it's super creative at the same time, because going through the parking study, that was the thing that came up. I mean, you look at the River Place development and the parking that was required for him downtown. How often is that lot sitting empty in the back of that? It was a requirement we had for him. So I think it's super creative for us to try and manage this. As we said last week, somebody has to pay for parking, and whether it's, and I think approaching it in this fashion is at least a step in the right direction to trying to do something different than what we did in the 70s or the 50s, or, you know, requiring the parking that doesn't get used all day.
To jump on Mark's point, I go downtown a lot, and that row in the back there, it's almost always open, and no one can park there because it's private. So I do think we have to do something, and obviously we all want to see businesses downtown thrive, and I understand, I believe the concern from some of the business owners I've talked to is that we're going to create all this residential area downtown, and then it's going to make less parking, and I get that concern. But at the same time, we've already created this lack of commercial parking and over parking of residential, which is blatantly evident from what Councilmember Miller just said. So it is confusing, I agree, and I'm doing a ton of research and reading on it. So thanks for the presentation, but I think we have to do something, right? So we have to get creative and try to work out ways to have more parking without it just sitting there as dead space. So anyway, that's enough from me. Anybody else?
I would just want to add, this is a function or an offshoot of the visioning plan in the first place. And we keep talking about what it's been like parking and what the problems are now. But seems to me we're thinking about how do we make downtown ultimately more inviting for more people to live, more people to come down. To me, it's a mindset. We all believe we have to have a park right in front of someplace free, and that's changing. I think as much as it makes people angry, I think it also behooves us to continue to think in terms of how's this going to play in 20 years? What difference is this going to make to the development of downtown? People's lifestyles are changing. Maybe 5 years from now, every family of four will only have one car, or there'll be smaller cars or whatever. But if we just continue to build the city the way it's been built, we're not going to be ready for what's coming. So I appreciate the work that you've done. Like I say, it's based on a long-range vision. It may not solve our problems now, but it will sure prevent a lot more in the future. So thanks for your work.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to see a little more input from the downtown businesses. They're the ones that really have the big stake in this. The ones I've talked to are in favor of more parking, and they're ready to take over their time to have their 4-hour parking, their 2-hour parking, and those kinds of things. But the ultimate decision should be made by the businesses downtown. That's all.
Sorry, can I speak?
Go for it.
How many sessions or work sessions did we have where anyone could come and put their input in, approximately?
So the commission held 3 public hearings and 4 work sessions, and we held work sessions for developers, and we also held a work session with Community Main Street.
Okay. So there was opportunity for folks to participate in the vision from the beginning, right? When did the vision start again? It wasn't just last year or the year before, it was...
So the vision plan was adopted in November of 2019.
Okay.
The code was made available to the public at the end of February, or the middle of February.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate the creativity, and I feel like, yes, our business owners are important, but our citizens who utilize that space are also important. So I totally appreciate your creativity. You have an expertise that I don't have, and I'm okay with admitting that. And you help me think, and I appreciate you. So thank you.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but this plan, it doesn't exclude us from looking at other creative parking aspects to create and generate more commercial parking, right? So in other words, we're still reaching out to vacant lots in the evening to have more parking. And I have no clue where we're at with it, but there's always the possibility, possibly, maybe not, of a parking ramp somewhere down there in the future. So again, we have to try something to change and fix this. So I don't know. I'm still, like I said, I'm still going to keep researching, but it seems like the older ways of putting a lot of surface parking aren't serving us as well as they could.
I think, just to mention, I think one of the things in the downtown is we've got the public parking system, and then we have the private requirements that we're talking about with this zoning ordinance. So it'll apply to, what we're talking about today applies to new private development, private property, not the public parking system.
So with that being said, if it applies to private, and say someone was going to take a spot in the lot, they would get a ticket if they didn't move their car in 4 hours, correct? So
In a public lot, if they
Yeah.
would park there more than 4 hours, yes.
so therefore, we don't really run the risk of someone getting a condo and then just parking in the city lot. I mean, I guess they could,
Could, yeah.
but we would make some money.
It might not be convenient for them because
Okay,
they'd be
just
further
curious.
away, maybe.
I hadn't thought of that aspect. Susan, go ahead.
Oh, just a follow-up, maybe that they could send us was, we did ask for some examples, or you mentioned examples for that shared parking. When you get an opportunity, I'd like to see the examples, because I'd like to contrast the liability laws for the states that you're talking about, that those are in. So just forward us those examples that you said you had.
Go ahead, Daryl.
some of the points here, we had lots of meetings and opportunities for the public and business owners to attend, but they can't comment until the end result product is presented, and that's this right here in front of us. So to Mr. Sires' point, I want to hear from the public and the business owners what they think of this here after it's now in front of us in print, and have a charrette or a couple sessions when they can attend and they're not busy trying to make a living, selling things or bartending or whatever. Because I've talked to bar owners, I talked to boutique shop owners, and they were not familiar with this end result. They might have attended the meetings, but they didn't see this to know. Because a number of them, I had to email this presentation to them to see what it is. They don't understand, and they're concerned. Backtracking a little bit to the parking lot not being utilized, the ones along Washington are full at 5 o'clock. I park in them all the time if they're open, but they're filled right away, so we're not, unless you're talking about the one on 6th, was it First National, or whatever their name is now? That one's a ways away, that's a long walk. That probably doesn't get utilized a whole lot. But, so, this isn't quite ready. To Dave's point, I want to hear from Community Main Street more before we just keep on rolling with this process. I think we deserve some input from them. It's their livelihood, and it's, if they don't understand it, to have them buy into the program, they need to understand it better and ask their own questions, just like we're asking. We're kind of asking the questions secondhand from us visiting with the shop owners. I want to hear directly from them in a meeting, sitting out here and coming to the mic and explaining their concerns. I think that's prudent.
Where are we in the process? Are we nailing this down tonight, or what happens next?
It's a work session, so technically we can't take any action
Right,
tonight.
I know, but I'm just wanting to make
Okay.
the point that we're still in the process, sort of, aren't we?
Yeah, so I think what we would like from the council tonight is to know if a majority of the council would like us to make a change to the code, or whether a majority is satisfied with the way it's drafted currently.
Karen, that's not really what a number of people are saying. I'm saying in particular, and the shop owners are saying they want a chance to give feedback on this.
So just to
So
be,
let's set a session
Okay.
where we can have the public come in here and speak.
I feel, I don't want to discount what the public's got to say about this, but we just heard from them last week, and by and large, the opinion is the city's responsible for parking. And
That
we have
was-
to have a balance here.
That's the kiosks and those sorts of things.
Well, it's almost every time. I mean, every time parking comes up, it's the city's responsibility.
That's the public portion of that. Now we're talking private-public sharing. I don't see any harm in hearing from the public. If we're going to change their potential way of making a living in their perception, they should be able to come here and Mary can critique and answer their concerns. I think that's prudent.
I'm not opposed to that either, but we're going to have that process, are we not? This is going to come before the council. If it goes to pass, there'll be a public hearing, if not 2 of them, where people can speak up and inform us of what we think, or of what they think, and then...
That's after this is drafted, but let's hear what they have to say before they get to the point of drafting it.
I just want to make clear, the code was drafted and available to the public in February, so it hasn't been changed since February, and this draft has been on the table for the public to review. And of course, it will be available again during the public hearings and available for public to comment and make, for example, in the Planning and Zoning Commission hearings, people from the public came and made suggestions for specific changes, and that's what you saw in the decision matrix, is suggestions from the public during those public hearings, during the public review period, since February, for people to come forward and say, I don't like what's in this draft. I would like to suggest a change. And so that's kind of how we're working through that process. And there may still be people out there that come forward during your public hearing or hearings and make a specific suggestion for a change to the code. And then we would bring back something for the council to consider and some information on those particular requests.
None of the people I spoke with watched the planning and zoning meetings, and it was a good number of the merchants. And none of them are familiar with the design matrix. I think,
But they know of the meetings. I mean, there is some responsibility on their part to be engaged. They're public meetings, they're notified, they're invited, there are multiple opportunities. And then everybody waits until we pull the trigger, and then that's how it works all the time.
Yeah.
And I get it. And there's still gonna be some more opportunities for more public input.
Were these public meetings or were they Zooms?
But everybody, I mean, we were all living under Zoom at the time. And if your business is gonna be impacted, or it's gonna affect how many people can come to your restaurant, you'd think that you'd wanna be involved when you're making the plans instead of coming and taking pot shots at it. I mean, I don't mean to be negative, but that's kind of, we have an ongoing process. And it's human nature not to get involved until you're impacted by it. And then we have to take taxpayers' money that we pay to these people and ask them to redo it. I mean, yeah, there's still opportunity, but to change the process because other people didn't come when they had the opportunity doesn't make sense to me anymore. We've done it enough, and
well, Frank, they were all under the pressure of the COVID. Everybody's trying to live under Zoom. The fact that this might have been available since February, but not widely spread or even sent directly to them to know. Right. I mean, I'm talking about 7 or 8 people, and I'm just relaying what they're telling me, and they're not happy. I don't have a business downtown personally, you know, and I don't even get feedback, only maybe one person out of my ward at this point, for the commercial part of it. We haven't talked about the residential impact here of changing how many bedrooms you got to have for an owner-occupied or a rental. That's different than what is existing. That's a whole nother topic there, because we're not even talking about the rental being able to use street parking as an accepted place to park. Because in this scenario, the underparked commercial area, those people are going to drive into the residential area and park in front of your house if you're on the edge of downtown. That's what's going to happen.
But I feel like you kind of know that. I mean, I lived on the hill for 7 years, and when you live on the hill, there's things that you're seeking on the hill, and you kind of know that. You know that parking's going to be, you know, what it is. I mean, and I talk to people too, so it's great that we're all talking to people. All kinds of people have different opinions. A good portion of my friends love the urban core, and they live in the urban core for a reason, and it's because they like that vibe. And
that's fine.
Yes, and in the end, there might be problems that, you know, in the future have to be addressed and changed. But to talk like this just all of a sudden came up, and to talk like there wasn't opportunity for people to participate is not true. And we keep saying that, and we get people stirred up in this city, and it's wrong. We create division, and it's wrong.
Going back to Frank's point, I think we have a process, and straying from, I mean, we can shut the city down if we want to keep not making decisions on things. I mean, it's our job to weigh through this stuff, to hear from the public, and to make a decision. Sometimes not very well liked decisions, but we have a process that allows people to be involved, and more than one opportunity to be involved. And then we need to make a move. We can shut the city down if we want to stop making decisions because of this or of that or of whatever. Is it perfect? No. I mean,
Perhaps
it seems like local government is changing in this regard to where we can't make a decision, and if it's not right, we change it, right? Nothing is going to be perfect. We have to start somewhere. We have to have something to go with to get out to the public to say, here's what we're proposing. Here's your opportunity to speak. If you don't like this, or if there's something glaringly obvious that's going to be a problem that you think, you have that opportunity to bring it forward.
Well, Mark,
Listen, and then we make a decision based on the public.
if we overbuild, do we just lower the building a little, couple stories lower and take away the residential?
We can get into all sorts of scenarios. I think we have a process that works. This isn't new.
We're nearing our end time, and I hate to interrupt, but it's a heated, topic. I realize that there's two philosophies on parking. I've been doing a lot of research on it, and I would urge everyone to do research. So we need to come to a consensus. Do we want to have another work session on this, or do we have a consensus that we want to go forward with what's there and let the process play out? I guess we can't really make a motion, but is there a consensus to continue on the same process that we've been doing?
Is there a third option of a committee meeting so that the public could actually speak?
Well, that's a good question. So, Ms. Howard, could you let us know the timeline of how we're kind of going forward from here? Is it going to go forward from here to an ordinance, to a public hearing, or are we going to bring it to committee? What's kind of the next steps?
I think that's really up for the council to decide. But if you're satisfied, if there's a consensus that they're happy to move the drafted code the way it is now forward, we would then set a public hearing at a future meeting, and then go forward with the public hearings. If there's more to discuss, if there's more information that, there's a consensus, there's more information needed, you can set another work session or go to a committee of the whole meeting. We just need to have some direction on what you would like us to bring back for that meeting.
So there's still more public meetings. There's still opportunity, rather than a special meeting, the process goes now to another public meeting and more input can be received and changes still made?
Right, I mean, that is the purpose of the public hearing process, and, that we did make some changes at the Planning and Zoning Commission because of that, because people bring forward good ideas that we didn't think about.
And I will point out, just to give Daryl a hard time, but this process has actually outlasted COVID. I recall your first exit meeting when you, from a year and a half ago, was just before COVID started. And it was such an exciting plan a year and a half ago, and we're still talking about it. So to feel like we're rushing through things is not accurate, And so 2 years of this, 2.5 years, or whatever it is, I think, and there's still opportunity for public input. So I would hope we can move it forward. And if there's good arguments made and some good alternatives, still make those accommodations at the next stage of the process.
I believe Ron wanted to say something. Go ahead, Ron.
Thanks, Mr. Hardy. I think where we're at right now is we've gone through a pretty long and arduous process, as Mr. Dare said. There's a year and a half to 2 years that between the visioning and also developing the ordinance. I don't think we want to get into a position where we feel like anything's rushed or, hey, we got into there. So if we need to take another committee meeting and talk about parking, we can do that at maybe the next committee meeting, and then start in on the public hearings within the July timeframe. So July and August would be that. So so once we get there, we can just keep moving forward. But we don't want to feel like this is a rushed process.
So, Mr. Gaines, could we look at the calendar, and we got the 4th of July weekend meeting, basically? There'll be a lot of people traveling.
Oh, I thought you wanted to do it on the 4th.
We can do it on the 4th, but I won't be here. The next council meeting is the 6th, which would be, again, the 4th of July weekend. If we went with the 19th, would that be a problem if we scheduled a committee meeting?
I don't think that would be a problem.
Okay. I think that'd be a good idea.
are we trying to reach a consensus to just have a committee meeting on parking, or are we going to look at other aspects of, is it going to encompass the entire plan? I guess that's up to us, but I'm just
So
asking.
The direction staff was given at the last meeting
Was
was
parking.
parking.
That was for this particular meeting. There's other parts of the form-based zoning that could be addressed. As Ms. Sheets brought up, that this started in 2012 with a desire of council to revisit zoning or updating our zoning. There's only 2 council members on here that were around in 2012, and I'd like to have that explained to us and the public so they can see it. What is form-based zoning? How does it relate to traditional, if that's what you want to call what we have had, and incorporate that into it as well.
All right. Well, I think we've reached a point where we need to look for a consensus. So obviously, is there a consensus that we want to go to a committee of the whole, or do we want to continue with the process as it stands?
Well, I'd like a committee of the whole to hear from the public.
I would as well. Committee of the whole.
So 3 for a committee of the whole.
I can go for a committee of the whole meeting, but I don't think we should open it up to everything. I mean, we just spent
Fair
almost an
enough.
hour on parking, so I don't know that we need to go back through the whole thing. Let's
Just-
open it up to the public to comment on this part of it.
Fair enough. I could
Then
go with
we
a
make a
committee of the
decision
whole
from
on
there.
parking as well. So, well, looks like we have a direction to go forward with a committee of the whole on parking aspect of the downtown zoning. Thanks for the discussion. I know it's always fun when it comes to parking. We're going to take a break here and get reset, and let's see, we have 6:11 right now. I heard that he wants 7 minutes, so 6:18, we will be back for a committee of the whole. Thank you.